Welcome to Eat, Drink, Think. I'm Amy O'Neill Hauk. In this podcast from Edible Communities, a network of magazines published across North America, we celebrate all things local and sustainable in the food world. Today, we're speaking with Nicola Twilley. Nicola is a journalist and frequent contributor to The New Yorker. She's the co-host of Gastropod, a podcast that looks at food through the lens of science and history. Nicola's first book is Until Proven Safe, The History and Future of Quarantine. This summer, her latest book, Frostbite, How Refrigeration Changed Our Food, Our Planet, and Ourselves, was released. Nicola has been studying what she calls our artificial cryosphere for over a decade. The resulting book is part immersive journalism. She dons a huge parka and spends a shift working in a refrigerated warehouse. Part travelogue. She makes her way from California to Rwanda to study their emerging relationship to refrigeration, to China, where the relationship to cold and food is transforming quickly, and to Svalbard, Norway, and the seed bank at the edge of the world. Along the way, Nicola shares the fascinating history of refrigeration and lets us in on the global effects that keeping food cold has had on the food system, on humans as eaters, and on our warming planet. Nikki, welcome to Eat, Drink, Think.
Thank you for having me.
We're glad you're here. So to start off, what drew you to study cold as it relates to how and what we eat?
Yeah, you have to cast your mind back quite a way here because I have been working on this book for more than a decade. So go back to the early 2010s when farm to table was the hottest topic in town. And every new restaurant was farm to table this, farm to table that. And Michelle Obama was planting a, vegetable garden in the White House. And lots of books were coming out that were showing us the reality of those farms. You had, Michael Pollan's Omnivore's Dilemma. You had Eric Schlosser showing us really what that farm looked like. And I was jealous of those books and I wished I had written those books. But then I sort of got hung up on the word "to." And I thought, well, they're showing us the farm. What about the preposition here? How does it get to the table? And at first it was just honestly curiosity. I thought to myself, all those foodies who go and visit the farms where their chicken is raised or whatever, or the feedlot where, where they bought a steer at auction like Michael Pollan, they've never seen inside a refrigerated warehouse. No one does. That isn't sort of on the agenda. I've sort of gone with these writers that I admired to farms, but I haven't gone to the refrigerated shipping containers and the meat lockers and the juice tank farms and the avocado ripening rooms. And so I thought, well, maybe I could go and take a look at those. And then as I did that, and it started out honestly, actually just initially as an exhibition documenting those spaces, I realized, but they've also changed what we eat, what it tastes like, where it's grown, how good it is for us, the shape of our cities. They've contributed everything from, the invention of the hoodie to Irish independence. Like, there's a story here. So it sort of just kept expanding and unfolding in front of my eyes. But that's how it began.
Yeah, there's so much interesting history and detail, and it coalesces really beautifully around the idea of the cold chain. Can you talk about that phrase and give us a little bit of a definition, and maybe also tell us a little bit more about the scale, the vastness of the cold storage that the average eater never sees?
Yeah, so the cold chain is the industry term for all of the cold spaces that your food moves through on its way from the farm to the table. And so your home fridge is really just the tip of the iceberg. I mean, literally, it's a tiny space, cold space. When I would tell people I was writing a book about refrigeration, most people thought about their fridge. And most people don't have a visual picture of this enormous distributed artificial winter that we've built for our food to live in. And that's the cold chain. So it's everything from the trucks and the refrigerated shipping containers to the warehouses and distribution centers, to very specialized architectures. So I mentioned juice tank farms. Orange juice is always stored in these vast tank farms. Banana ripening rooms, specific sort of architectures for specific foods. It's also, there are specific refrigerated ships to move juice around the globe, for example. So it's this whole linked network of cold spaces. And because they're all separate, they're very rarely considered as a whole. But if you put them all together, to me, I realized, oh, this is like a third pole. This is enormous. We are talking 5.5 billion cubic feet and growing. I mean, expanding rapidly of artificially chilled space that we have built for our food to live in. And just because it is this sort of private business, it's not infrastructure the way that, the freeway system is infrastructure. We never look at it. We never consider it as this sort of backbone, interconnected backbone of our food system. And so part of what I wanted to do was just make that visible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you have an anecdote about someone in Britain calling during the pandemic and saying, how much refrigeration do we actually have in this country?
I know. The government called the Cold Chain Industry Association and was like, you remember shelves were emptying during COVID. The supply chain was like completely up the spout. And the government realized they had no idea how many refrigerated warehouses the nation's food supply depended on. And it's really weird if you think about it. I mean, it's essential. I mean, nearly 3/4 of everything we eat passes through the cold chain at some point between the farm and the table. And that includes a lot of things that you wouldn't even imagine, like the peanut butter that goes into your M&Ms or your Cliff Bars. That's stored in refrigerated warehouses, even though when you buy the M&Ms or the Cliff Bars, they're not refrigerated. So it's really at the heart of almost everything we eat. And yet it's sort of invisible, even to people you would think would know, like government officials.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. One of the things that struck me as I was reading Frostbite is that the history of artificial cold is relatively short as innovations go. And you say, our ancestors learned to control fire before modern humans even evolved, but our ability to command cold at will dates back little more than 150 years. Can you talk a little bit about the early history of refrigeration and the challenges that were overcome?
Yeah, I mean, this was a surprise to me. I think if humans have been eating and drinking as long as we've been on this planet, and now we have a refrigerated food system that we are utterly dependent on, but it is an incredibly recent innovation. I think most people don't think about that. So it's really only 150 years ago that we have the first prototypes, a century ago that it was domesticated, that you start to get the first mechanical refrigerators in homes. And for a long time, that's because cold was just a complete mystery, honestly. I mean, the finest scientific minds of history, Leonardo da Vinci, Galileo Galilei, Robert Boyle, Francis Bacon, Isaac Newton, they all considered cold. They tried to figure it out. Where was it from? How did it get produced? Was it a property of what they called frigorific atoms? Did it live at the poles and somehow disperse down, maybe through the ground, maybe through the air? People had no idea, and it was immensely frustrating, and you could not produce it at will, which meant that the only sources of cold were these natural ephemeral sources, snow and ice in the winter, maybe a little bit of the natural chill of caves. But it was just not under our control, and it was a complete mystery. And so it wasn't until, in fact, two things happened. One, a Scottish doctor figured out how to create ice in the 1750s. It was like a weird experiment inspired by observing that if you put a thermometer in alcohol and then take it out again, the temperature drops because everything is evaporating from, that evaporation is essentially heat moving away. And that's the weird thing about cold is you don't make it. It's not a thing. It is actually just cooling is the sensation of loss as heat moves away. That's what's happening there. So it's not surprising that it was a mystery. I mean, even as I say that, philosophically, it's kind of a weird concept. So he discovered how to do it, but no one had any real use for it. It was seen as a party trick. He wrote a pamphlet in the 1750s with this little observation and was like, someone should look into this. And no one did. And then a high school dropout from Boston figured out how to monetize New England's real natural asset, which is cold in the winter, and launched a global frozen water trade. And the success of that, and the fact that suddenly you could ship ice around the world and with it food, made people start to see, oh, it would be really useful if we could actually not just harvest natural ice and move it around and try to preserve it in our ice houses, but actually make this stuff on demand. And that the natural ice business is what spurred engineers to go back and look at this science around evaporation and develop the very first prototypes. So really surprisingly recent.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, my grandparents had ice delivered, and my grandmother had an ice house. So we can, like, in recent memory of some people, the non-mechanical cold was still around.
Oh, totally. In England, I grew up in England, and my grandparents didn't have a mechanical refrigerator. My grandparents didn't have a mechanical refrigerator until after the Second World War. So very much, in not my living memory, but people's living memory.
Refrigeration plays a part in the early industrial consolidation of wealth. You mentioned that it was market forces that drove people to finally figure this out, and the subsequent creation of the industrialized food system that persists today. And one of the ways that you illustrate that in the book is discussing the transformation of how meat was slaughtered, butchered, and moved from farm to kitchen. So I was fascinated to read, for instance, that animals used to be walked alive into cities and slaughtered not far from where they would be eaten. You write, within our first century of domesticating cold, we not only rearranged meat production and consumption, with effects extending from Irish independence to Amazonian deforestation, but also altered the composition of Earth's biomass beyond recognition. Can you talk about these changes and how refrigeration fit in?
Yeah, so it's a huge story. Interestingly, meat was really the second thing to be refrigerated. It was beer and the brewers that went first, and they were the ones who kind of figured out mechanical refrigeration. But it didn't take long for the meat industry to get on this. One thing that happened was that in the 1700s, and especially the 1800s, for the first time, cities were getting above 1 million people. And that's really the first time in history. In ancient China, you find some cities that may have gotten as big as 1 million, but really this idea of 2 million people living in a city, or 3 million as we're living in London in the 1800s, that's entirely new in human history. And immediately you run into a problem of how do you feed them? Because throughout human history, people have lived near where their food is. So you could slaughter the animal and eat it, and it was all just right there. Suddenly, everyone's crammed into cities. Well, are the animals crammed in there too? And it turns out that actually, yes. I mean, there were pigs in Central Park. Kensington, which is a very posh part of London now, was estimated to have 3,000 pigs living there in amongst the houses. Dairy cows were kept in basements underneath the Strand in London. Cows were marched down from the fields and slaughtered in the city. There's amazing descriptions of even herding turkeys into Philadelphia to slaughter them there, which anyone who's tried to herd a bird, good luck to you. But that was how you would get a perishable food like meat into a city. It had to be slaughtered there because you couldn't transport it already dead. It would go bad. And so this was seen as a real crisis. At the time, researchers had just figured out how to isolate the nutrients in food, and they had discovered protein and isolated it and decided it was the only essential nutrient, like early version of Protein Bros and paleo style. And so they were in a panic because here are these working classes who are toiling in the factories that, are getting going in the Industrial Revolution, but they don't have access to any meat. Like, what to do? And it was a genuine panic. So getting refrigeration working for meat was a huge breakthrough. It involved a New Englander who moved to Chicago, a guy called Gustavus Swift, who was primarily motivated by his total, I mean, I hate to say it, but he was like a classic New England tightwad. He really hated any waste, any opportunity to make money that he left on the table caused him almost physical pain. And the thing about shipping animals on the railway, the new railways, he could ship them from Chicago to New York. But when you ship, a steer or a pig, more than 50% of it is inedible. So you're paying to ship something that's going to be thrown away the other end. Plus, then you don't get the opportunity to monetize all those byproducts. If you're slaughtering all in one place, well, then there's enough blood and enough bones and enough intestines that you can, gather them all together and turn them into useful byproducts, but not if you're shipping it. So it just drove him bananas, basically. And he figured out how to slaughter his cattle in Chicago and ship them to New York. It took decades. It was actually, an incredible amount of meat went bad along the way, but he did it. And what happened is, the price of a steak fell, was cut in a quarter. Suddenly, meat became affordable to all the time. And you get a whole array of, these, like margarine becomes this cheap option too. There's a whole sort of side world of animal byproducts that become accessible too. But primarily the price just really drops and people start eating a lot more meat. And then because of that, well, you can raise meat at scale. Suddenly, if you can slaughter meat at scale and store it at scale, now you can raise it at scale. And you can raise it in parts of the country where it made no sense before. Which means that, well, it's worth wiping out the last of the bison on the Great Plains, for example, because you can raise cattle there and you can actually get them to eaters. Before, you could raise cattle there, it'd be great, but you couldn't get them to people who were going to eat them. It radically changed both the quantity of meat people ate and thus the quantity of livestock that we could raise, to the point that, as I sort of say in the book, now there are, if you looked at the planet as an alien, you'd be like, well, the dominant life form is, cattle and chickens. This planet is not a planet of humans. It's a planet of cattle and chickens, because that's what we mostly have. And you could not have that much livestock in that quantity with all the associated problems that come with that if you didn't have a refrigerated food system. That's not, people at the time were just trying to solve the problem of how do we get meat to these workers in the cities. But the side effects were huge.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned Swift, and Frostbite has a huge cast of really colorful characters, many of them scientists and researchers passionate about food science. Do you have a favorite that you'd like to introduce us to?
I love them all my unsung heroes of refrigeration. I guess Polly Pennington is one of my favorite. Her actual name is Mary Pennington. She went by Polly. She was born in the late 1800s in Philadelphia. And weirdly, as a young girl, she was reading in a library and she came across a chemistry textbook and it changed her life. She said she was just struck by the fact that there was this invisible reality all around her. And so she decided to become a scientist. And obviously, as you could probably guess, at the time there weren't a lot of female scientists. The University of Pennsylvania didn't actually award a Bachelor of Sciences to women, so she did the course but wasn't allowed the degree. She was only given a certificate of proficiency. But even so, she carried on. She ended up doing a PhD, which she had to wrangle her way into. And then, oh, what job? There are no jobs for female scientists. So she set up her own lab and got working on that. But she ties into the story of refrigeration in a really interesting way. At the time, in the early 1900s, the U.S. had just passed its first food safety law, the sort of ancestor of what has become the FDA today. And so the Pure Food and Drug Act was passed in 1906, giving the U.S. government the power to regulate our food supply and make sure it's safe. One of the new technologies people were using was refrigeration, but the head of what became the FDA, Harvey Washington Wiley, he had no idea whether, is refrigerated food safe? No one knew. At the time, warehousemen were big fans of this exciting new technology. And so they would sort of, suddenly they didn't have to throw food out. They would put out their meat for sale. And if it didn't sell, then they'd put it back in the refrigerated warehouse that night and bring it out the next morning. Good as new, right? Because no one had, and this is something that it sort of took me a minute to get through my head, is like, oh, we didn't just have to invent the refrigeration machine. We had to figure out how to actually use it. How do you refrigerate food to keep it safe? That's not, it's not just like, oh, put it in the cold and you're done. There's a specific temperature range for different foods and a specific amount of time that they can be outside of that temperature. And all that had to be figured out, and Polly Pennington turned out to be the one who figured it out. So Harvey Washington Wiley recruited her, even though the civil service didn't actually technically hire women at the time. He put Dr. M.E. Pennington on her application form. And before anyone realized what was happening, she got the job. She put on her sensible divided skirt and sweater set and went out and figured out how to make refrigeration actually work. So she rode around the country on a rail car, testing the temperature of chickens every 100 miles. She did a lot of lab-based experiments. And at the time, you read about the horrors. She was like, why are all these chickens turning deep emerald green? If you bought a chicken today and it was like bright green, I think people would genuinely be distressed. But at the time, it was a relatively common occurrence. And the reason is, at a specific temperature, there's a specific chemical reaction that happens in the blood of chicken, and it literally turns from red to green. And the chicken kind of turns this very bright emerald green. So she did the lab work to figure that out and say, okay, you can't store them at this temperature. You have to get them past this temperature this quickly, which takes this amount of refrigeration power, etc. She did all the work, and she figured out, got the warehousemen to do it. And her real legacy is actually that Americans have so much faith in refrigeration now that, if it's not refrigerated, people think it can't really be fresh. When she started out, no one trusted refrigeration. It was seen as deadly, essentially, and at best a con. So a way to kind of give you food that wasn't really fresh, that if you weren't wealthy enough or well-connected enough, you would have to deal with that. But it wasn't good food. Everyone knew refrigerated food wasn't fresh food. Now the two things are synonymous. So that's her real legacy, is getting Americans to trust refrigeration by making it work.
You mentioned, I think it was in the conclusion, that around that time, people were actually skeptical of the market forces around refrigeration and the sort of the reasons for doing it, being financially based. And I think now maybe as a society, we're less skeptical about that sort of thing. What do you think?
It was really funny to me to see that, like, oh, right. People were probably right to be suspicious of refrigeration. It was implemented in pursuit of profit. And then, thanks to Polly Pennington, food safety, but never implemented in pursuit of I don't know, more delicious food, healthier food, food that's better for the environment, a more equitable food system, none of those things. None of those priorities were, being considered in refrigeration's implementation. And so people rightly saw who was profiting from it and were a little like, what's in this for us, Of course, cheap meat was very popular. And immediately caught on. And but there was some horror associated with it at first. If you could afford to eat actually fresh meat, i.e. meat that had been slaughtered relatively nearby and relatively recently, you still did. I mean, there was, and again, it makes total sense, but there was a weird sense of like this, what is this undead food? In the past, if you had seen a chicken, a carcass that looked fresh, you knew exactly it couldn't be more than like 48 hours old and from a certain distance away. You had an inherent sense of how fresh that food was. Now it could be 6 months old, a year old, 5 years old. How were you to know? And where was it from? You didn't know. And so there was just this sort of huge mistrust. And you still see it today. That's the funny thing. When I went to Rwanda, for example, there's really hardly any cold chain there at the moment, but there is a refrigerated warehouse at the airport for export purposes. So some people are growing like green beans to ship to supermarkets in the UK or the Netherlands and things like that. If those are rejected for quality control reasons, like they're just not perfect enough to be shipped, then they can be sold on the local market, but the traders have to sit them out in the sun to warm them up before anyone local will buy them, because local people don't trust refrigeration. They don't think it's truly fresh. And to see that and realize, there's a necessary skepticism, actually. Like, why are we doing this to our food system? What are the benefits for us? I think is really smart. And that's actually why I tried to write this book is, as the rest of the world refrigerates, hey, why don't we think about that? Could we do it differently? If we had different end goals, if this wasn't just implemented in pursuit of profit, maybe we might end up with a slightly different cold chain.
Yeah, the book got me thinking about, just as we've been discussing, the changing definition of perishability. First, maybe we're thinking about preventing rot and waste and food safety eventually. And now researchers know more about how storing food affects nutrition. We can keep something looking fresh and maybe tasting kind of normal, but does our well-traveled and long-stored food lose something when it comes to nutrients as we now understand it?
It definitely does. And it does on a lot of levels. So one of the things that I found that was slightly horrifying to me is, you buy a bag of spinach at the supermarket, you eat it a week later, you pat yourself on the back because you're eating vegetables and you didn't throw out the spinach and aren't you good? It will have up to 50% less nutrients than it did when you bought it. Fruit and vegetables especially are still breathing. They call it respiring because it's fruit and vegetables, not a human, but that's basically what's happening. It's still metabolizing, it's still inhaling and exhaling. And as it does that, it burns through its own internal resources. And those internal resources are the things that we want to eat, the nutrients, even the flavor chemicals. So refrigeration doesn't actually tend to necessarily improve food. It does with some things. I mean, your curry always tastes better after it is sat in the fridge for a day, and there's science behind that too. But it doesn't for everything. The other thing is fruit and vegetables that have been bred to be able to be shipped under refrigeration have, as a general rule, not been bred for maximum nutrition and flavor. Like, you have one priority. You go to the vegetable breeder, you say, this is what I want, a tomato that can be, harvested while it's green and hard and shipped around the country and then ripened. And so it looks nice, red and shiny when I want it, but not bruised. I don't want it to bruise. And so the vegetable breeder executes on all of that. And as it turns out, unfortunately, in breeding a tomato that could do all of that, they lost the genetic machinery for flavor. It just kind of, that wasn't in the variety, that got lost along the way. And so that is why supermarket tomatoes taste of nothing, and they can't taste of anything. It doesn't, they have no potential to taste of anything. And what's interesting is that flavor is directly correlated with nutrient levels. So there's really interesting research, a phenomenon that USDA has noticed but has no explanation for, which is that the nutrient levels in our fruits and vegetables have gone down. I mean, some estimates say you need to eat like 8 oranges to get the amount of vitamin C that your grandparents would have got from 1 orange. I mean, there's a lot. This kind of research is tough. I should say that right out front, because like the data doesn't go back very far, but the phenomenon of nutrient loss is real, and part of that, one of the sort of speculated causes of that is we've bred for fruit and veg that can be shipped and refrigerated rather than fruit and veg that has high nutrients and high flavor. So,
can you talk more about the flavor that has been affected by refrigeration? Is breeding the main source of change, or are there other things that go into things tasting different than they used to pre-refrigeration?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, one of my favorite scenes in the book is this thing called the 1911 Cold Storage Banquet, which was held in Chicago. It was a multi-course banquet, and the gimmick was that everything served had been refrigerated. And when I first saw this, I was like, oh, that's so cute. Like, they're showing off their new toy, this new technology. They're so proud they've managed to refrigerate everything. And I was also like, wow, look at that. Like, it would make headlines if you served a meal that wasn't refrigerated today, as opposed to one where the gimmick was everything had been refrigerated. But it was a sort of PR exercise to try to get people, and specifically, actually in that case, Congress, to think that refrigerated food was safe. And at the time, there was this, as we've discussed, this fear of refrigerated food, and so a lot of the headlines around it were really interesting. And one of them, the Chicago Inter-Ocean, was like, listen, refrigeration's probably going to catch on because it's so economically useful, and the warehousemen are into it, and that's the way our food system is going. Our only consolation is that the generations who haven't been born yet will never know what fresh food actually tastes like, and they won't miss it. And when I read that, I got chills, because I was like, that's us. That's me. So we, and some of the things that referred to were sort of the taste of the different seasons in your butter, and the idea that you would have that seasonal taste. You would know the difference between spring butter and summer butter, and it's just, I wouldn't know the difference between spring butter and summer butter. I've got no idea. I would love to, but but no. And so there are these sort of subtle things that have been lost. There are some very practical things that are lost too. I mean, just stone fruit, for example, it can't, the machinery that makes flavor switches off in the cold. So if you refrigerate it for more than 48, 72 hours, that's it. You're done. It's not going to taste of anything, because the fruit physically has no equipment anymore to make the flavors that we want out of our stone fruit. There's, it's not all bad. Meat definitely tastes better if it's given a chance to age in the cold. But yeah, there are real shifts. The other real shift is, of course, what we eat. So whereas in the past, you might have eaten a variety of locally harvested berries, now you can go to the store and you can get blueberries all year round, every single day of the year. They don't necessarily taste it very much in the middle of winter when they're coming from Chile, but they're there. But that means that there isn't a space in the grocery store for, I don't know, like the Marionberry or something that is small, not commercial. The thing that I ended up realizing about fruits and vegetables in particular is that each one is like a pop star with its own writer. They all have very, very specific requirements. This berry has to be handled this way, and that berry has to be handled that way. They have slightly different temperature requirements, humidity requirements, even atmospheric gas requirements. And so if something is small and seasonal and local, it doesn't get a post-harvest regime. It doesn't have the research done to figure out how to get it around the country, into supermarkets, into our fridges. And then what happens is we don't eat it because it's small and local and you can only get it, locally. And so a lot of foods just kind of fell off the menu because they weren't amenable to the kind of scale that refrigeration works best at.
Mm-hmm. On the flip side of that 1911 dinner, you took a trip to China. And in addition to diving deep into the world of frozen dumplings, you got to have a meal where none of the dishes you ate had been touched by artificial cold. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, it was an amazing meal. So this is at a astonishing restaurant outside of Hangzhou in China. And the chef when I told him that refrigeration had been voted the most important invention in the history of food and drink by Britain's Royal Society, which is Britain's sort of leading society of scientists. And he just laughed his ass off. I mean, he could not believe it. But he is just very committed to traditional preservation methods as producing these incredibly delicious flavors. And I came to realize, given the amount of human ingenuity over time, again, going back to how recent refrigeration is, so recent, and how long humans have been fighting against microbes that want to eat our food before we can eat it, it's not surprising that actually there's this wealth of culinary ingenuity around keeping food good that has yielded incredibly delicious results. Many of our most delicious foods. Cheese is just something, for example, that's milk's bid for immortality, as one writer said, but it's a preservation technique. It's an attempt to make milk, take milk away from the microbes that want to eat it and save it for ourselves. And yet it results in such glorious flavors and textures and overall deliciousness. And so celebrating that sort of pre-refrigeration flavor palette is what he was doing. And so, yes, there were the mud-preserved duck eggs and the radishes. I remember in particular, he was saying the folks at the top of the hill, they salt their radishes first and then bury them in the ground second. And the folks at the bottom of the hill do it the other way around. You could taste the difference. He gave me the two radishes and I could taste the difference. So it was an amazing meal, but also for him, he's just sort of a chef. He just wants maximum deliciousness. For me, I thought philosophically, this is a sort of a window into the world of flavors that we developed as a pre-refrigeration food preservation technology that have sort of been slightly whitewashed by the fact that now we can just go and have a fresh radish every day of the year.
Mm-hmm. So quote unquote fresh. Yeah. It's interesting you mentioned, battling the microbes, that a lot of our battle involves aligning with other microbes that are going to work well for us and
exactly. That's
and
cheese
taste good.
is like, yeah. Bring in the friendly microbes. It's a huge amount of human ingenuity when you look at it. Chemical, biological warfare, like making allies strategically. It's it's kind of an amazing history.
Mm-hmm. So I moved into a house in 1996 that still had a working 1940s Frigidaire refrigerator, complete with the little glass refrigerator where to store leftovers in. And it stopped working a few years after that, but there was a freezer in the basement of the same vintage that just kept trucking for a long time. And that came to mind because of your chapter on refrigerator design and the idea that people usually buy refrigerators because one stopped working and not because they're just in the mood for a new $3,000 appliance. And yet capitalism moves these manufacturers to come up with reasons to make new refrigerators seem necessary. Can you talk about how this refrigerator design and how it has and hasn't changed since they've become ubiquitous in our homes?
Yeah, this was a really fun chapter. And I spoke to a bunch of refrigeration designers, and including the woman, Mary Kay Balder, who came up with the French door refrigerator. Dun, dun, dun. This was a huge breakthrough for appliance makers because, like you say, people just used to use their old fridge, and then when it broke, they would buy a new fridge, or get the old one repaired. Shock horror. So you didn't buy a fridge because the new shiny fridge was out. And French doors are what really changed that. That's the first time these folks all told me that's the first time in fridge history when people were like, ooh, my fridge is working. I don't need this. Mary Kay told me that the company gave a very conservative projection for how many they'd sell at first. And so then when it caught on, these French door refrigerators were back ordered for months. And people would go into the stores and say, it doesn't matter because my old fridge is working. I just put me down for the new fridge. And she said that was the first time that had happened. People were buying a fridge because they liked the way it looked. And there are a few things going on there. One is that it was the era of the open kitchen. So it started, everyone was watching Top Chef and people were wanting to, the era of the kitchen island and everyone dining there. There were certain trends going on in kitchen design that really led people to think about what their appliances look like. And stainless steel appliances were introduced, and these French door refrigerators were available as stainless steel. It looks super professional. So that was a big part of it. It was also an era where suddenly everyone had credit cards, which was not the case before. So it didn't matter if you couldn't pay for it right now, right? So a lot of things went into the huge success of the French door refrigerator, but it was kind of the first time where that manufactured demand sort of took off. Which is not to say that people haven't been trying to induce that since the start. And so, everything from it took decades before someone had the idea of putting shelving on the inside door of the refrigerator. It was the Crosley Shelvador was the first one that was introduced. And it was a housewife came up with the idea and sold it to Crosley, and they introduced it, and it was under patent for a while. So for a long time, the only fridge you could get with shelves in the door was the Crosley Shelvador, and it was a big hit. It seems so logical now. There's things that you think are good ideas when you hear them, and then you're like, oh. So I remember there was one where it was a foot pedal operated fridge door. And I was like, that's genius. Like, what if you're holding something and then you can just kind of kick open the fridge door? It ended up having the nickname the knee buster because the door opens outwards and it would take people's knees out. The Lazy Susan. Listen, if you are at all into TikTok, people on TikTok are constantly discovering new fridge organization methods that they think are totally original to them. And one of them is like, this Lazy Susan revolutionized my fridge. It's like, no, people have been trying that since the dawn of time. Oftentimes what happens is kids start spinning them really fast and then everything flies off. Plus, people hate the unused space at the edge. The fridge designers are full of stories of like things they thought would be great ideas and then in testing. I remember Mary Kay telling me that she pulled out she developed a sort of kids section that you could pull out, like a little pantry almost, so you could see either side of it, which was kind of neat because people complain that stuff gets lost in the back of their fridge, and this you could pull out. But the problem was that kids would hang on it and then it would break. So there's always something. It's it's a really fascinating sort of field of what people say they want and then how in reality they use their refrigerator, and a perennial problem of people being like, oh, stuff gets lost in there, and there never really being any solution to that. So
this might be a good moment for us to talk about the relationship between refrigeration and food waste.
Yes. Oh, yeah. Good segue. Yes, because of course, when refrigeration was introduced, people were like, this is amazing. It will prevent so much food waste. And it did. Um, uh, from USDA figures, about a third, about a third, in some cases more, of food rotted on its way to market. So between the farm and the market back in the 19 teens, say. Once that food supply chain was refrigerated, that waste shrank dramatically. What happened, interestingly, is that on the domestic side, so supermarkets, restaurants, and the home consumer, food waste crept up by an equal amount. So if we had been throwing away a third of our food on the way to market, now we throw a third of it away at the consumer end of the spectrum. And what's interesting again is that appears to be not just an American problem, because if you go to China, for example, which I did, where they sort of built a cold chain almost overnight, it was part of their 12th five-year plan. And it transformed the country's food system overnight. But one thing that you saw almost immediately is that rates of food waste at the consumer level in people's homes skyrocketed. And rates of food waste, in between getting the food from the farm to the store or something, that shrank. So exact same process that happened in the US just 100 years later. And I think the theory, it's hard to say, but I think the theory is that by having this incredible sense of abundance, one food writer calls it permanent global summertime at the market. You can get every fruit and vegetable and every food in every season, in any quantity, all year round. And there's more. There's always more that I think people perhaps lose their sense of, wow, I better not waste this. Then there's another problem, which is you have the fridges themselves becoming places that people refer to it as, or have a sort of safety net approach to it. The fridge, it will stay good in the fridge. We were planning to eat those chicken breasts tonight, but actually, Paul has basketball, and so we'll just pick something up after. And it's okay. They're in the fridge. They'll stay good until they don't, and they're not. So there's this sort of, a fridge is not a bank vault. Stuff is still aging and going bad in there. It is not just sitting there. But people treat it a little like a bank vault. So there's that issue, that is the fact that our fridges are just too big. And so we buy too much to put in them, and then you can't possibly finish that amount, because there's something sort of bad feeling about an unfull fridge, an empty fridge. You want it stocked with fruits and vegetables, so you feel like your family is going to be healthy, but then you can't eat it all. And then finally, I think there's this issue of freshness that you raised before, and people not knowing if food is still good. And the story of the sell-by date is the sort of classic of this. It was really introduced in the 70s initially for food. The earliest example is on a beer label again, because beer is always first. But it was introduced in response to consumers just no longer having a sense of like, how fresh is this? And they wanted to know how old their food was, actually. And there was some potential legislation being mooted in Congress, like we should have labels on our food saying how old it is. And the food manufacturers like, hell no, we do not want that. We do not want people buying a Washington State apple in June and being like, wow, this is 11 months old. That's really old. Because that's what is actually happening. It's just that right now, people don't know, and that ignorance is bliss, at least for the food manufacturers, maybe for the eaters too. I don't know. Sometimes knowing things makes life harder. So the food manufacturers sort of got out ahead of the potential legislation and said, we'll do something called best before or sell by. And what that is nothing. It means literally nothing. It's not federally regulated, except in the case of infant formula. That's the only one that has regulation around it. There's I think it's half the states require some sell-by dates on some things. Half the states require none. There's no difference in food poisoning between those states, whether your state has that legislation or not. The differences between the states are also totally lacking in logic. Like Montana, cream will go off or milk will go off a week before it goes off in the rest of the country. Well, that's just not the case, is it? And they don't mean what people think they mean. They don't mean this food has now gone bad. They mean this is roughly how long we think it's going to be good for, plus a margin of error, so give or take. And that's just, but the quantity of people who won't drink milk outside of its sell-by or use eggs outside of their sell-by or, butter, things like I'm like, goodness me. So yeah, that contributes to a huge amount of food waste too.
Mm-hmm. In Frostbite, you draw parallels between the shrinking natural cold places on the planet and the growing amount of artificial cold. Can you tell us about the effects of refrigeration on the climate and how we might, or how people are imagining we might mitigate them?
Yeah, this is the part that I was like, oh, this book is actually urgent. Because as it turns out, cooling and cooling in general, but also cooling for food are a huge chunk of what is contributing to global warming. So it contributes in two ways. One is obviously the energy we use to run all the refrigeration machinery, which is very hard to decarbonize and use renewables because refrigeration runs 24/7 and you cannot connect it to a solar if it also has to be getting energy at night, and there aren't batteries sufficient, et cetera. It's an area of research right now, but it's tough to decarbonize. So that's one aspect. The other aspect is the gases we use in our refrigeration machinery. They're called refrigerants, and they leak to the atmosphere in varying degrees. Some as you operate, more as you decommission the machine, but they turn out to be super greenhouse gases. And by super, I mean many thousands of times more warming per ton than a ton of CO2, for example. So Project Drawdown, which is, an NGO looking at like what's the best bang for the buck to help us get a handle on climate change, made a list, came up with their number one most important thing was refrigerant management. And when that came out in 2018, I remember the headlines, they were like, we're surprised. We didn't see that coming. So that's a huge issue too. And, of course, the MAGA Republican types are now fighting any attempt to use lower GWP refrigerants because that is an impingement on their freedoms. So there is legislation looking to do that, and it's being fought. But it's a huge issue. That's just, okay, so right now refrigeration is already, keeping our food cool is already contributing the same amount of emissions as aviation, a little bit more. So that's a huge issue. You hear about the problem with flying all the time. You're invited to carbon offset your flights. No one's thinking about refrigeration. And the other problem is the rest of the world is building a US-style cold chain right now. China, which has had its refrigeration revolution, is still building. Currently, they have about a sixth. Like every Chinese person has about a sixth the amount of cold space it takes to feed an American. So if China builds a US-style cold chain, if they keep expanding, think what that's going to do to emissions. India is building a cold chain. Sub-Saharan Africa, where the population is supposed to expand by a huge amount over the next 20 years, is building a cold chain from scratch. If they do it using US-style technology, then, one expert said to me, there just won't be a harvest to put in all of those refrigerated warehouses. The other issue is that refrigeration becomes less efficient the higher the external temperature goes. So there's some stat, and I'll get it wrong, but it's like for every 2 degrees Fahrenheit, the external temperature raises, your refrigerator becomes 20% less efficient or something. So once we get to a world that we're already in, sadly, where external temperatures are increasingly elevated, our fridges are taking more energy to do the same amount of cooling in the first place. So the whole thing is actually a giant and pressing problem that people have really only just woken up to. The UN formed a committee on sustainable cooling in 2018. I keynoted at its first meeting, and it was a bit of a like, holy crap moment as people realized that this is a looming problem, that there aren't new technologies ready to deploy right now. And we can't just say to sub-Saharan Africa, hey, hang out for a bit and we'll figure this out. No, they want a cold chain now, and we can't say they can't have it. So it's a huge and imminent crisis, and one that is really only coming to the forefront of people's minds within the past 3 years.
Mm-hmm. And you said, ready to roll out, there isn't sustainable cooling. What about in under research, or other things that people are looking into?
Yeah, this is something that is exciting. So people are trying to figure out, the most efficient ways to set up cold chain. People are also thinking about, I went to Rwanda, for example, to look at this project called ACES, the Africa Center for Excellence for Sustainable Cooling. They're trying to also think about, okay, how do we do this in an equitable fashion? How do we do this in a way that will keep smallholders on the land if they want to? So you don't just have to work with large-scale farmers who are growing food for export. You could share the benefits locally. So there is that type of initiative that is sponsored by the UN, the British government, and Rwanda working together. There is also exciting research into different ways of cooling. Some of that I look at in the book. A lot of that is a little bit away from prime time, although just in the past couple of weeks, there's been a what's called a barocaloric cooler, so a cooler that doesn't use any refrigerants at all, come online 6 times more efficient than a fridge. And no polluting refrigerants. The problem will be getting that manufactured at scale and at a competitive price point. The other thing that I realized as I looked into this is that, of course, we need cold beer. We definitely need cold ice cream, but we actually don't need cold meat, cold apples. We just need fresh meat and fresh apples. And so are there ways to preserve freshness without cold? And it sounds totally counterintuitive and bananas especially to American ears. It's like, are you kidding me? I would eat unrefrigerated meat. But there is, for example, supercritical CO2 pasteurization technology that would allow you to store meat at ambient. This is a product that is literally going to go to market, not with meat, because people would freak out, with frozen French fries that are not frozen, that can be stored at ambient for 6 months or more, because they've been this supercritical CO2 pasteurization process. And so if we can do that and we could pull things out of the cold chain, there's a nanoscale coating made from lipids that keeps fruit and vegetables fresh for, at ambient temperature, gives them, extends their life, their freshness for 4 times over, which is exactly what refrigeration does. Well, could we pull fruit and veg out of the cold chain? Could we reduce our dependence on this one technology and just use it for what we need it? And what would that mean? If you, for example, didn't have to only grow varieties that could be shipped under refrigeration and instead could use this coating, well, wow, maybe we could have access to some more delicious, more nutrient-dense varieties. Maybe things that are currently not commercially viable, like a pawpaw, could be for sale in a supermarket. Maybe that would change the size and scale of farms. Maybe if this powder could be sprayed on by smallholders in Rwanda, then they wouldn't have to scale up and to the sort of extent that you need to make a refrigerated warehouse like viable for your business. So it has these ripple effects, and I think that's really what I was so excited about with the book is once you see how much refrigeration has changed about our food system, you can flip that and say, okay, it's a lever. We could use it to rethink our food system too. We have to rethink how we use refrigeration for climate reasons. Now let's try to think about how we might redesign it for all the other outcomes we want too.
Mm-hmm. We talked about the relatively short period in which refrigeration evolved, and you're right, refrigeration was implemented for the most part in order to optimize markets rather than human and environmental health. And you go on to say cold was a key ingredient in the construction of a food system that prioritizes convenience, abundance, and profit over public health or planetary boundaries. Really, the whole idea of a global food system co-evolved with refrigeration, didn't it? And we've just been talking about some of the innovations that might allow us to disentangle that. How might we go about continuing that evolution in a way that's more supportive of the planet and those that are feeding ourselves here?
I mean, I think this is an area where knowledge is important. Just the same way that people didn't know the realities of what it took to raise that cheap beef and that cheap chicken. And books like Omnivore's Dilemma and then the TV shows that came out of that and things showed people. And so now, still plenty of people eat cheap meat, but plenty of people have chosen not to, or have chosen to eat plant-based instead, or at least feel vaguely guilty. That's step one. I think this is another situation where knowledge is actually really important. The fact that refrigeration has worked so well for so long in the background has just completely sort of taken it out of visibility. Mm-hmm. People don't think about it. And my goal with writing this book is to say we need to think about it. And as we think about it, maybe we'll support some of these other technologies. Maybe we will buy the, Appeal is the name of that coating I was talking about. Maybe we'll buy the Appeal coated fruit. Maybe we can rethink our need to have a second fridge in the garage. And maybe we can also have thoughtful conversations with growers, with government officials about what we could be doing better in our food system. I mean, I've been amazed with the response to this book, like invitations to talk to the cold chain industry, to talk to New York City's Economic Development Corporation about what refrigeration should look like in the future in New York. How should they invest? I think there's an opportunity for people to have these kinds of thoughtful conversations once you get the picture of what refrigeration is and does and how we need to rethink it.
Mm-hmm. I felt optimism reading the sections about Rwanda when you were talking about these areas of the world that are developing their cold chain, and maybe they won't just mimic the bad things that have been done in other parts of the world.
I mean, I hope that's where I feel most optimistic. It's going to be hard for us to change our food system, although we're still building new cold space rapidly. But and you saw it with cell phones. Rwanda never built landlines. They just went straight to cell phones. They never had checkbooks. They just went straight to digital banking. Maybe they can have a better food system by skipping out on the traditional cold chain and doing something more thoughtful, nimbler, that does consider issues around, economic impact and equity and flavor and nutrition and traditional crops. It gives me hope that, for example, something like ACEs, this initiative between the Rwandan government and the UN and the UK, is going forward and trying to think about that in a thoughtful way.
Is there more you want to tell us about the reception the book's been getting in the industry?
I mean, other than to say I'm really excited, I was nervous. When you put out a book, it's not I think I should be very clear, and I hope I have been, that it's not like I hate refrigeration. Like, absolutely not. You can pry my own fridge out of my cold, dead hands. Like, I love having a fridge. I think the refrigerator has been an amazing invention. That doesn't mean I don't think we should ignore its downsides, which is what we have done. And so I thought that was clear, but it's easy for an industry to be like, what do you mean? Like, are you against this? And absolutely not. I have had nothing but thoughtful, interested interactions I was part of the Thermo King book club. Thermo King makes refrigerated transport refrigeration. So that's what you see on all the trucks. And they have an internal book club in which they read Frostbite, and I came and visited. So for me, that's a really good sign too, because this is an industry that I think has been out of the limelight, that has could easily be defensive as a result, and has not been, is instead very concerned about sustainability in the future and wants to be part of the conversation, and is actually excited that people are focusing on it. So that's been a huge, I was nervous, and I have been very delighted about that.
Well, we'll look forward to any future reporting that you're doing about how our cold chain is evolving. Nikki, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. This was fun.
We've been speaking to author and podcaster Nicola Twilley. Thank you for joining us today at Eat, Drink, Think. If you liked this episode, be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and don't forget to pick up your local edible magazine. You can find show notes for today's episode at ediblecommunities.com.